It's been a little over 9 months since millions took to the streets during last year's George Floyd protests, right? This wasn't, of course, the first wave of BLM that had really taken off during the protests over the shooting of Michael Brown in 2014. But, I don't know in early 2020, how many of us really thought that an upsurge would be coming. But then the pandemic hit, right? With the pandemic came lockdowns, right? Millions lost their jobs and millions more were forced to work in dangerous conditions, to be praised as heroes by the corporations who deprived them of basic safety measures and cut jobs and wages. And the government really did nothing, right? I think we all remember, Trump's comment that the pandemic will be over by Easter, right? It'll be a beautiful timeline. But it's not just the mishandled pandemic is not just on his shoulders. A reflection of the stimulus check fight we're now seeing in the Democrat-controlled Congress. Pelosi actually shot down the first stimulus check proposal back in March, insisting that it be means tested. Millions of Americans were suffering, and neither party was willing to do anything to help. Instead, they tried to force us back to work. Politicians of both colors pushed through reopenings at a time where it was painfully obvious that it was too early, preferring to let the virus run its course on millions than to grant more than a token amount of material support and concessions to the working class. So on May 25th, 2020, when George Floyd was murdered by Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, protests quickly exploded on a massive scale. Months of pent-up anger at the system that had so plainly ignored our suffering turned it into one of the largest civil rights movements in this nation's history. And this movement spread internationally to over 60 countries. In Worcester, ISG helped organize our first George Floyd protest on May 30th. But it would be the protest organized a few days later by local Democrats, including City Councilor Christian King, that would be remembered. And some of you might be familiar with the June 1st protests. Some of you might have even been to it. In addition to Councilor King, Mayor Joe Petty, City Manager Ed Augustus Jr., Police Chief Steve Sargent were among the local politicians who attended that protest. And late that night, after politicians had gone home, as the protest was winding down, a group of about 70 split off from the main protest and began marching down Main Street. And the protesters almost immediately faced a significant police response. Police sent squad cars to corral the protesters, and a line of riot police began to form, right, trapping them. Police declared the protest a riot and flooded side streets, blocking all the exits as they ordered protesters to disperse. Soon, without violence from the crowd, without any warning given, police began to fire on the crowd with pepper spray pellets and smoke grenades. And I'll repeat that again, right? There was no violence from the crowd. Video evidence shows this. The police fired on a peaceful crowd standing up against police brutality. Once that began, the protest dwindled to only about 10 people at that point. But soon locals began to exit their home, right? Brought out by the noise, with some joining the protest as they realized what was going on. And most of those arrested were in that second group, right? Most of those who are currently being charged with failure to disperse from a riot, which is a charge that carries potentially a year in prison, were locals who were standing outside of their homes nearby, a quarter of a mile from where the order to disperse was given. And while they arrested these protesters and bystanders, the police were happy to continue the violence they had initiated, beating the arrested with batons, shoving them to the ground, smashing their phones, deleting evidence off their devices. At the end of the night, roughly 20 protesters were arrested, charged with failure to disperse from a riot, disturbing the peace, disorderly conduct, and more. City manager Ed Augustus, the day after the protest, claimed the protesters were bent on destruction and chaos and praised the restraint of the officers involved. What restraint, right? Video evidence shows the police antagonized protesters, handing out violence and retribution without provocation. And many of those arrested, far from the violent intent that Ed Augustus describes, didn't even attend the protests. They just lived nearby. Right? What right do we have to protest if at any time the police can react with violence and aggression to us exercising our basic democratic rights to provoke protesters into raising a fist in defense so that they can declare the whole thing illegal and go to town only to be praised for it, right? We need to recognize these charges for what they are. They are political charges levied with the purpose of dividing the movement, intimidating protesters, and eroding our fundamental rights. This repression is not just a Worcester phenomenon. Across the country, over 14,000 people were arrested at the BLM protests. At the end of the day, the United States deployed over 90,000 soldiers, the largest military other than war in US history, to put down these protests. And this repression was also international, right? In Nigeria, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement morphed into the End SARS movement, which faced even harsher repression than BLM did here. In late October of last year, actually, the Nigerian army opened fire with live ammunition on a crowd of peaceful anti-racist protesters, killing 12 people. And just a few weeks ago, actually, police in Nigeria arrested something like 40 protesters at the site of that massacre last year. And this included a member of the Democratic Socialist Movement, which is ISG's sister organization in Nigeria, who was brutally beaten by police while in custody. Across the globe, protesters were met with violence, beatings, murder, and all other forms of repression for standing up for their rights. And while the protests have quieted since last summer, that repression is still here in the form of the political prosecution of those thousands of activists. They're hoping that nobody is paying attention, right? So that they can lock these people up and throw away the key. So that next time we have to get out and stand up for ourselves, there's that weight hanging over our head. What if I'm next? Who will fight for me? If we want to protect the movement, if we want to protect our democratic rights, we have to start by setting an example here in Worcester and fighting until all these political charges are dropped. And I think it's worth asking, right? With all this evidence backing up the protesters, why can't we just simply wait for the court system to acquit them? Well, I think anyone who was involved in BLM, they're familiar with the idea that the cops themselves uphold and defend racism. But let's talk a bit about why that is. I think we all know, right? Income inequality runs deeply in our society, right? That fundamental, persisting inequality for thousands of years between the haves and the have-nots, the 1% and the 99%, right? Today, we call those the capitalists and the workers. And as much as they tell us today that class isn't real, we're all in this together, right? Fundamentally, we are not. Every dollar of Jeff Bezos's $200 billion net worth was wages that his workers earned that he did not pay them. No matter how nice they claim to be, the capitalists are where they are because they exploit their workers. And we're the 99%, right? So there are far more of us than there are of them. So from that, right, you get the need for order, right, as they say, to keep the system running. The police, the prisons, the military, court systems, so on, right? The modern conception is that these institutions were created to fight crime and stop evildoers. But we can look back through history and see that the goal of these institutions has never been to protect citizens. It's been to protect property, the property of the ruling class. And guess what? The property of the ruling class just under 200 years ago here was slaves, right? Millions of Africans kidnapped from their homes solely for profit, right? And that's why the police, as we know them today, got their start as fugitive slave catchers and also strike breakers, right? Both of whom were hired by the ruling class for the protection of their property. Malcolm X has a famous quote. He says, "You can't have capitalism without racism." And it's true. Right? Racism built the profit and the power necessary to overthrow feudalism and bring about capitalism. Racism is baked into the very foundations of our capitalist society. So why not put faith in our legal system? Well, because at the end of the day, it's not on our side. It is on the side of the police. It is on the side of capitalism, on the side of racism, right? And it will not stand for us unless we make it stand for us. There was this phenomenon early into the protests last year where cops were kneeling for protesters, making a symbolic gesture to ending police racism. Worcester Police participated in this at the June 1st protest. And, then these same cops who knelt for the protesters would later that same night be the ones beating protesters with batons and declaring a curfew and arresting protesters on the spot for breaking it, right? The lesson is that just because they pretend to be on our side doesn't mean they really are. The same is true of the legal system, and the same is true of corporate politicians like the city councilors who called the protest, who pretend to stand for the movement. It didn't matter that 12 out of 13 of the Minneapolis city council members when George Floyd was murdered were Democrats, with a Democratic Party mayor, with a Democratic Party governor, with a Democratic majority in both houses of the state legislature. The narrative right out of the gate was that the solution for police brutality was voting Democrat and nothing else. In fact, one of the biggest reasons BLM faded was that it was deliberately demobilized in support of Biden in the 2020 election, right? You know about George Floyd, you know about Jacob Blake, but did you hear about Rodney Applewhite, Casey Goodson Jr., right? Benny Edwards, Andre Hill, Dalal Id, Patrick Warren Sr., right? All these incidents where police murdered innocent Black men. Each of them would have sparked huge protests if they happened in May or June. But because they happened after Biden had won, the Black Lives Matter national organization, Black Lives Matter Global Network, was silent on all of these. What they did have time to do is send an official request for a meeting to the Biden-Harris administration, who then promptly ignored that request, right? The Black Lives Matter Global Network demobilized the movement in support of the Biden campaign, and they didn't even get a form letter rejection in return for their troubles, right? Recently, one of the local sections of BLM out west split from the national organization, citing the relationship between the global network and the Democratic Party as the most important issue, right? They pointed out, rightfully, the Democratic Party has historically rejected and ignored BLM's demands and have always been a pro-police, pro-prison, pro-capitalist, anti-worker party. Biden wrote the 1994 crime bill that helped build mass incarceration and picked top cop Kamala Harris as his VP. During the protest, Biden called for the political arrests of anarchists and refused to support defunding the police. For what Biden really wants, we should look at a speech he made in mid-2019 to his wealthy donors. No one's standard of living will change. Nothing will fundamentally change. We're about 2 months into Biden's presidency, and I think those words hold truer than anything he's said since. The truth of the matter is that the Democratic Party has been just as complicit in police brutality, if not more complicit than the Republicans have been. They are not allies in this fight. They are opponents who just happen to have friendly words. So if we want any hope of the next wave of BLM being able to make serious change, we need to start building our political independence from corporate politicians in the Republican and Democratic Party now. The work we do now to build an independent movement that can fight for our rights here will build the groundwork for future struggle. People want a political alternative, but that won't appear overnight. It's the result of work like this. So if the legal system doesn't stand on our side, right, how do we have any hope, right? Well, if we understand why this persecution is happening, we understand how to stop it. These arrests were made to quiet the movement, to get protesters off of the street. That's right. Why, despite our right to a fair and speedy trial, the first court hearing was scheduled a full 5 months after the arrests. The hope was that once everyone had gone home, right, once BLM was just a memory, nobody would be watching as they put these protesters in prison. So what happens if we build a mass movement around this case? What happens when every court hearing is packed by witnesses ready to get out and demonstrate if injustice occurs? What happens when sentencing these protesters will only incite more unrest, more protests, more desire for change? That is what we need to create. We can, through mass pressure, make dropping the charges seem like the preferable option. But mass pressure alone can't accomplish that. We need a campaign. Not only did the first court hearing take 5 months to happen, after that it was a 2-month wait until January, then a 2-month wait until March. Now it's another month until April. And this is very much on purpose. The longer the courts continue to drag their feet, the more time there is for activists to lose focus, burn themselves out, get demoralized, to give up and go home. The representatives of capitalism know that the working class can't be defeated head on. Their best weapon, the weapon that they are using, is time. So why do we need a campaign? Well, if their weapon is time, our defense is organization, right? We're not lacking energy. The protests last year proved that. I mean, we are the 99%, right? We have more power than we could ever need to change society and improve our conditions. If sheer numbers was all it took, we would have no trouble standing up to police brutality. So we need to do more than throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks, right? We need to draw a path to our goal and democratically discuss and debate the tactics and strategies we'll use to get there. We need the organization that can let us be more than the sum of our parts, that can let us be a real collective fighting force focused on a common goal. So what does a campaign look like? Well, if anyone still has doubts about the role that cops and the justice system play in defending capitalism, I would refer you to the example in 2018, when a member of our sister organization in Nigeria, the DSM, was arrested for helping striking food workers win a 30% pay rise, overtime pay, and more. The charge was inciting workers against management, right? So in response, our DSM comrades organized a solidarity campaign, and they've had consistent mass mobilization at every court hearing, right? This has thrown a wrench into the plans of the police, who have gone back and arrested this person 5 or 6 times with new charges to try to intimidate the movement. Without the campaign, they'd already be in prison, right? Prosecutors tried to lock him up and throw away the key, but mass pressure has prevented that. That's an example of the kind of mass pressure we've been building in Worcester since October. We have turned out en masse to every court hearing so far, bringing 60, 70, 80 plus supporters to show their solidarity each time. On Monday, actually, the clerk was so shocked by the number of people that he stalled on letting us into the courtroom for and something like half of the defendants were kept in the waiting room for the first 15 minutes of this so-called public trial, right? We had 20 people at that time outside the courthouse on the ground, picketing, demanding that the charges be dropped, demonstrating that this campaign is more than just hot air, right? And for each of those interventions to be successful, a lot of less visible work goes on behind the scenes, right? Leafleting around the city, right? Doing tabling and standouts to reach workers, writing op-eds and letters to the editor about the Solidarity campaign, you know, whatever outreach we can do to reach people about this campaign. And this public meeting is a part of that, right? And we've also been building a coalition of organizations to fight these charges. The Central Mass and Pioneer Valley chapters of the Green Rainbow Party, Mass Political Collective, and DefundWPD have all thrown their weight behind this campaign. That's a good start, right? And if you're involved with any organizations who want to take a part in this fight, you know, this is somewhere that you can make a difference. And we've been applying pressure, right? We held a rally outside of City Hall after the first hearing to bring forward our demands. We have held a call-in campaign asking supporters to put pressure directly on the public officials who have the power to do something and are standing by while it happens. That doesn't just include the district attorney. City councilors called the June 1st protest. City councilors spoke at that protest. City councilors praised the cops the next day for their actions. Since that protest, it's been City Council who's given an extra $400,000 to Worcester PD. It's City Council who has just approved new predictive policing surveillance, right? We have raised this solidarity campaign at City Council meeting after City Council meeting. Maybe some of you heard my contribution last week. But City Council has been silent, not even willing to put words behind the protesters, much less their actions. So we need pressure. And building that pressure, building an organized campaign that can fight back against the political persecution of anti-racist protesters would be a huge step forward for the anti-racist movement in this city. But the relevance of this campaign extends beyond the borders of Worcester. As I mentioned before, thousands of protesters around the country are facing charges like this, but very few campaigns have been organized in defense of these protesters. Many of the ones that do exist only have a presence on social media, which means they have little ability to actually reach the working class and draw them into this struggle. There is a dire lack of campaigns like the Nigerian example that truly use mass mobilization to put pressure on the government and end political persecution. We can build an organized Worcester anti-racist coalition with democratic structures to discuss and debate strategy and tactics with the involvement of unions and other organizations. If we can build this here, it won't just be an example of how to defend against political charges. It'll be an example of the kind of organization and coalition building that needs to happen for the next wave of Black Lives Matter to make serious gains. It'll be a powerful tool of the working class in this city, connecting the anti-racist movement with other working class struggles to fight for the change that we all need. That has national implications, right? That has international implications, right? That's the first step in building the independent power of the working class. And that's the first step in a socialist transformation of society that can do away with the racist capitalist system and build a society democratically planned for the needs of all. That might be getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here, right? Of course. But if we are able to connect these problems under capitalism together and build the organization necessary to collectively fight for what we all need, a lot of things don't seem so far off anymore. So what's up next? Well, next court date is April 20th, right? And first, we want to keep doing what we've been doing, right? We will picket the courthouse. We will pack the courtroom. We will do leafleting, tabling, standouts. We will continue to work with other organizations in this city to build the power of this coalition. And I would invite all of you to join the Solidarity Campaign to help with this vital work. But we can't just tread water, right? We have to keep up the momentum. We have to step up pressure on the DA, and we have to get serious about bringing this fight to City Council. I would encourage everyone to come in on this point in the discussion. How can we bring this pressure to bear on the DA and City Council? What steps does this campaign need to take to make that happen? Maybe we could bring a bit of that democratic discussion and debate that needs to happen as part of this campaign to this meeting tonight. And what's more, my last point, there are some really important struggles in Worcester going on right now. Nurses at St. Vincent's Hospital in Worcester just went on strike this week, their first strike in 21 years, actually. UFCW 1445, another union representing 600 workers at St. Vincent's, has also announced that their contract negotiations have stalled. Beyond St. Vincent's, the EAW, the teachers union in Worcester, rallied in front of City Hall last week to demand Worcester School Committee return to the bargaining table. The nurses' strike is shaping up to be a flashpoint for organized labor in Worcester and for working class struggle in all its forms. We need to recognize that the anti-racist struggle in Worcester is just one piece of the overall puzzle of ending oppression in all its forms. By demonstrating solidarity across these issues, by showing up for the nurses on the picket line, showing them that we, the people in this city fighting racism, stand for them, we can make powerful allies. We can show them that the cops on their picket line are playing the same role that the cops did at the June 1st protest, which is defending capitalism. We can bridge these struggles and work together to build the organized power to make the change we so desperately need, right? They want there to be divisions, right? They want us to think of the union struggle, the Black struggle, the women's struggle, the LGBT struggle as separate issues, right? But we have a common enemy, the capitalist system that exploits us and represses us. And if we want to bring that idea to the working people of Worcester and show them that we really are on the same side and we really can win if we work together, it has to start with us. We need organized labor to be part of our strategy going forwards. We can win this struggle. They've done it around the world. We can do it here. But it's going to take the involvement, not just of ISG, not just of the people in this campaign, but of everyone here today. It's going to take the involvement of the thousands who stood up for the anti-racist movement on June 1st. It's going to take the involvement of the nurses, teachers, hospital staff, and more who are fighting for their basic dignity right now. If we build an organized movement to fight these charges, we will set a powerful example for the rest of the country at a time where victories for the working class seem so few and far between. It'll be a pole of attraction around which we can build stronger struggles to fight for bigger concessions. But that needs to start here. It needs to start now with everyone in this room today. Thank you.